The dust-filled air of Apache Junction, Arizona territory, stung Nora Hastings' eyes as she stepped off the stagecoach, clutching a worn leather satchel and a promise of marriage to a man she had never met. The year was 1882, and at 22, she was already considered by many back east to be a spinster. But the West offered new beginnings even if they came with whispers of mail-order bride that followed her like shadows. Nora brushed off her navy traveling dress, a garment that had once been fine, but now showed the wear of the grueling 3-week journey from Philadelphia. Her auburn hair, partially escaping its pins, framed a face that was pretty rather than beautiful, with intelligent green eyes that missed nothing. She scanned the small but bustling town, searching for the man who was supposed to meet her, Jacob Thornton, a cattle rancher who had placed an advertisement seeking a sturdy, practical wife in the matrimonial news. "Miss Hastings," a deep voice called from her left. She turned, expecting to see Jacob Thornton, but instead found herself looking up at a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His hat, a well-worn Stetson, was tipped respectfully in her direction. "I'm Quentin Abernathy," he introduced himself, not quite smiling. "Jacob asked me to meet you. There's been a situation." Nora felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of situation, Mr. Abernathy?" "The kind that involves Jacob Thornton being shot dead in a dispute over water rights 3 days ago." His voice was matter-of-fact but not unkind. Nora's legs nearly gave way beneath her. The journey, the plans, the future she had imagined all crumbled in an instant. "I see," she managed to say, though she didn't see at all. What was she to do now, thousands of miles from home, with barely enough money to survive a week? "I'm sorry to be the bearer of such news, madam," Quentin continued. "Jacob was a decent man. He spoke highly of your correspondence." A small crowd had begun to gather around them, curious townsfolk eager for a glimpse of the newcomer. Nora could hear the whispers already. "Mail-order bride. Poor thing. Came all this way for nothing." "I understand you've traveled a long way," Quentin said, lowering his voice. "I've arranged a room for you at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, at least until you decide your next steps." Nora straightened her back. She would not collapse in the street like some delicate flower. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Abernathy, but I assure you I am capable of making my own arrangements." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "No doubt you are, Miss Hastings, but Apache Junction isn't Philadelphia. A woman alone faces certain challenges here." "And what would you know of Philadelphia, Mr. Abernathy?" she asked, unable to keep a touch of sharpness from her tone. "More than you might think," he replied cryptically. "I went to university there before returning west." Before Nora could respond, a woman pushed through the crowd, plump, gray-haired, and wearing an expression of immediate concern. "You poor dear," she exclaimed, taking Nora's arm. "I'm Martha Peterson. Come along now, I've got a room ready and hot water for a bath. You must be exhausted." Nora hesitated, then nodded gratefully. As Martha led her away, she glanced back at Quentin Abernathy. He stood watching her, his expression unreadable except for a curious intensity in his gaze. "That's Quentin Abernathy," Martha explained as they walked. "Owns the largest cattle spread in the county. The double-A good man, if a bit solitary since he came back from back east. He seems direct," Nora observed. Martha chuckled. "That's one way of putting it, but there's not a more respected man in these parts." When trouble comes, folks look to Quentin. As they approached a neat 2-story house at the end of the main street, Nora asked the question foremost in her mind. "Mrs. Peterson, what am I to do now? I came here to be married, and now—" Martha patted her hand. "First you rest. Tomorrow is soon enough to worry about the future." The boarding house was clean and comfortable, if sparse. Nora's room had a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window overlooking the dusty Main Street. After a bath that washed away the grime of travel but not her anxiety, she sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to cry. She had left everything behind her position as a schoolteacher, her small circle of friends, the grave of her parents, all for the promise of a new life with a man who now lay in a fresh grave himself. The irony might have been amusing if it weren't so devastating. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Hastings," Martha's voice called. "Supper's ready if you're feeling up to joining us." Nora quickly dried her tears. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. I'll be right down." The dining room held a long table where several other boarders already sat, two elderly sisters who introduced themselves as the Mrs. Green, a young man who seemed to be a shop clerk, and to Nora's surprise, Quentin Abernathy. "Mr. Abernathy occasionally takes supper here when he's in town on business," Martha explained, noting Nora's questioning look. Throughout the meal, Nora was aware of Quentin's eyes on her, assessing, thoughtful. The conversation flowed around her talk of cattle prices, the coming railroad expansion, and local gossip, but she contributed little beyond polite responses to direct questions. As the meal concluded, Quentin finally addressed her directly. "Miss Hastings, might I have a word with you? In private." The table fell silent, and Nora felt every eye upon her. "Of course, Mr. Abernathy." They stepped onto Martha's small front porch, the evening air still warm from the day's heat. In the distance, the desert stretched toward mountains turned purple in the fading light. "I've been thinking about your situation," Quentin began without preamble. "Jacob left some debts, but his small ranch is still intact. It could be yours as is intended." Nora blinked in surprise. "How is that possible? We weren't yet married." "He filed papers naming you as his beneficiary when he began corresponding with you. It's not much, 100 acres, a small house, some cattle, but it's something." "I know nothing about ranching," Nora said, bewildered by this unexpected development. "You could sell it," Quentin suggested. "Use the money to return east." The idea of returning to Philadelphia, of admitting defeat, sent a wave of unexpected resistance through Nora. "And if I wished to stay?" Something flickered in Quentin's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or approval. "Then you'd need help. Ranch work isn't for the faint-hearted, especially not for a woman alone." "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Abernathy," Nora replied. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I don't doubt it, Miss Hastings. But there's strength, and then there's knowing how to drive off rustlers or survive a drought." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the small town settling into evening around them. "There's another option," Quentin said finally, his voice low. "One that might seem unconventional." Nora raised an eyebrow. "More unconventional than traveling across the country to marry a stranger." This time, Quentin's smile was genuine, transforming his stern features. "Point taken. What I'm suggesting is a business arrangement. I could use the land that was to be Jacob's. It adjoins my property and has a good water source. You could stay in the house, and I would pay you fair rent for the land." "And what would I do, Mr. Abernathy? I'm a teacher by training, not a landlord. Apache Junction is growing. We need a proper school." He gestured toward the far end of town. "There's talk of building one before winter." Hope, fragile but persistent, began to bloom in Nora's chest. "Are you offering me a position that doesn't yet exist? I'm on the town council. My word carries weight." There was no boastfulness in his statement, just simple fact. "But the decision would be yours, Miss Hastings. I wouldn't presume to dictate your future." Nora studied him in the fading light. Quentin Abernathy was not what she had expected to find in this dusty frontier town, educated, articulate, and showing her a consideration that seemed at odds with his formidable reputation. "I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Abernathy. I'll consider your offer." He nodded, then hesitated before adding, "One more thing, Miss Hastings. The town. They've already labeled you as Jacob's mail-order bride. People here can be quick to judge and slow to change their minds." "I'm quite accustomed to managing others' opinions, Mr. Abernathy," Nora replied, lifting her chin slightly. "I'm sure you are," he said, his eyes showing that ghost of a smile again. "Good night, Miss Hastings." After he left, Nora remained on the porch, watching as Quentin Abernathy's tall figure moved down the street toward the livery stable. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, and for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, Nora felt something besides despair. Whether it was the prospect of teaching again or the unexpected kindness of a stranger, she couldn't say, but it felt remarkably like hope. The next morning, Nora woke early, determined to see Jacob Thornton's property her property for herself. Martha provided directions and warned her about the heat, pressing a broad-brimmed hat into her hands. "It's 5 miles out of town," Martha cautioned. "You're sure you don't want to wait for someone to escort you?" "I'm quite capable of walking 5 miles, Mrs. Peterson," Nora assured her. Martha sighed. "At least let me arrange for you to borrow Mrs. Wilkins's mare. She's gentle as a lamb, and it'll save you from collapsing of heatstroke before you've been here 2 days." An hour later, mounted awkwardly on a placid brown mare, Nora followed the dusty road that led northwest out of town. The morning was still cool, but the sun promised another scorching day. The landscape, so different from Pennsylvania's green hills, spread around her in shades of brown and gold, punctuated by the stark silhouettes of saguaro cacti. She had ridden perhaps 3 miles when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Turning, she saw Quentin Abernathy approaching on a magnificent black stallion. "Miss Hastings," he called, slowing his horse to match her pace. "Out for a morning ride. I'm going to see the Thornton property," she replied. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Alone, as you see." He shook his head, but there was that hint of a smile again. "Then I'll accompany you if you don't object. I was heading that way myself." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the creaking of saddle leather and the soft thud of hooves on packed earth. "Tell me about yourself, Miss Hastings," Quentin said eventually. "What brings a Philadelphia schoolteacher to the Arizona Territory?" Nora considered how much to reveal. "My parents died last year, influenza. I found myself without family, with limited prospects, and—" She hesitated. "I read an article about women going west, about the need for wives and mothers in these territories. It seemed like an adventure, a chance at a different life. And Jacob Thornton's advertisement appealed to you. He wrote that he wanted an educated wife, someone who could help build something lasting." Nora smiled sadly. "His letters were kind, thoughtful. I believed we could have a good partnership, if not a grand passion." Quentin nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Jacob was a decent man, hardworking. He would have treated you well." They crested a small rise, and suddenly there it was, a modest ranch house with a barn and corral, set in a small valley with mountains rising in the distance. A stream glinted in the sunlight, and a small herd of cattle grazed on the sparse vegetation. "Thornton Ranch," Quentin announced. "Not the biggest spread, but the water makes it valuable. Jacob was smart to claim this land when he did." They approached the house, a simple structure built of adobe with a wooden porch across the front. It looked solid, if in need of some care. A chicken coop stood to one side, and a vegetable garden, now overgrown, stretched behind the house. "Who's been caring for the livestock?" Nora asked as they dismounted. I sent one of my hands over to check on things. Hank's been feeding the chickens and making sure the cattle don't stray too far. Quentin tied both horses to the hitching post. Shall we look inside? The interior of the house was sparse but clean: a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. Simple furniture, some books on a shelf, a rocking chair by the window. It was a bachelor's home, practical rather than comfortable, but Nora could see its potential. What do you think? Quentin asked, watching her face as she moved through the rooms. It's more than I expected, she admitted. But also overwhelming. I wouldn't know where to begin. Begin with what you know, he suggested. You're educated, capable. The rest can be learned. Nora ran her hand along a rough-hewn table, considering his words. You seem very invested in my staying, Mr. Abernathy. His expression became guarded. As I said, the land would be useful to me, and the town needs a teacher. Is that all? She asked, meeting his gaze directly for a moment. Something unguarded flashed in his eyes, something that made Nora's breath catch. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual reserve. Apache Junction is a growing community, Miss Hastings. Good people are always welcome. Before Nora could respond, a shot rang out, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Quentin reacted instantly, pulling her to the floor and covering her body with his own. Stay down, he ordered, his voice a harsh whisper. What's happening? Nora gasped, her heart pounding, not sure yet. Quentin crawled to the window, keeping below the sill. Could be rustlers or someone with a grudge against Jacob. He peered cautiously over the windowsill, then ducked back down. 2 riders about 100 yards out. They're circling around back. Another shot cracked through the air, splintering the doorframe. We need to get to the barn, Quentin muttered. My rifle's with my saddle. Are they trying to kill us? Nora asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Hard to say. Could be a warning, could be something more. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a revolver. Can you use this? Nora stared at the weapon. I've never. Point and squeeze the trigger, Quentin said grimly. Only if you have to. He glanced around the room. Is there a back door through the kitchen? Nora said, recalling the layout she'd just seen. Good. When I say go, we'll make for the barn. Stay low and run fast. Ready? Nora nodded, clutching the heavy revolver. Go! They burst through the back door and sprinted toward the barn, keeping the house between them and the riders. Nora's heart hammered in her chest, her skirts tangling around her legs as she ran. They were halfway to the barn when a horseman rounded the corner of the house. There! The rider shouted, raising his rifle. Quentin shoved Nora behind a water trough just as a bullet kicked up dirt at their feet. He fired back, making the attacker veer away. Keep going. He urged, and they made the final dash to the barn, ducking inside the wide doors. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, filled with the smell of hay and horses. Quentin immediately moved to his saddle, retrieving his rifle. Stay here, he instructed, positioning himself near a gap in the barn boards where he could see outside. Who are they? What do they want? Nora asked, still gripping the revolver. I intend to find out. Quentin took careful aim through the gap and fired. A cry of pain followed and the sound of a body hitting the ground. The second rider called out, Dean, you hit, Malone, Quentin muttered. Should have known. You know them, Nora whispered. Frank Malone and his brother Dean. They've had their eyes on this land since Jacob filed his claim. Water rights? Quentin raised his voice. Malone, this land belongs to Miss Hastings now. You've got no business here, a rough laugh answered him. The mail-order bride, she's got no right to it. A woman can't work this land. That's not for you to decide, Quentin called back. Now get your brother and clear out before I put a bullet in you too. Silence fell, broken only by the groan of the wounded man. Then Frank Malone's voice came again, closer now. "This ain't over, Abernathy, not by a long shot." Hoofbeats signaled their departure 2 sets, indicating the wounded man had managed to remount. Quentin waited several minutes before lowering his rifle. "They're gone. For now." Nora's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the revolver as she handed it back to him. "Is this normal?" In Apache Junction, a grim smile touched Quentin's lips. "Not normal, no, but not unheard of either. The Malones have been pushing boundaries since they arrived last year. They want control of every water source in the county." "And they'll kill for it?" Nora asked incredulously. "They'd prefer to intimidate," Quentin corrected. "Shooting was likely meant to scare you into selling cheap." He checked the cylinder of his revolver before returning it to his holster. "Which brings us back to your decision. What will you do now, Miss Hastings?" Nora looked around the barn, then through the door toward the house with its broken window. The peaceful scene of just an hour ago had been shattered, revealing the harsh reality of life in this territory. She should be terrified, should be planning her return to civilization that very moment. Instead, she felt a curious calm settle over her, along with a determination she hadn't known she possessed. "I believe," she said slowly, "that I'll need to learn to shoot, Mr. Abernathy, and perhaps you could introduce me to the town council regarding that teaching position." Surprise and something like admiration flickered across his face. "You're staying, then?" "I came west for a new beginning," Nora replied, straightening her shoulders. "It seems I've found one, just not the one I expected." Quentin studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, Miss Hastings. Let's get back to town and make arrangements. You'll need supplies, and I'd suggest hiring someone to stay here until the Malones cool down." As they prepared to leave, Nora took one last look at the small ranch house. It wasn't much, but it was hers a foothold in this wild new world. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them. And if the steady presence of Quentin Abernathy at her side gave her courage, well, that was something to consider another time. The next week passed in a whirlwind of activity as Nora established herself in Apache Junction. Word of the confrontation with the Malones spread quickly, and to her surprise, it seemed to earn her a measure of respect among the townsfolk. A woman who stood her ground against the notorious Malone brothers was clearly made of sterner stuff than they had initially assumed. Quentin, true to his word, had spoken to the town council about establishing a proper school. The local carpenter was already at work converting an abandoned storefront into a classroom, and several families had eagerly enrolled their children for the fall term. In the meantime, Nora divided her time between the boarding house in town and day trips to the ranch, always accompanied by either Quentin or one of his trusted hands. She was learning the basics of ranch management, though she had hired a young cowboy named Tom Russell to oversee the daily operations. On a warm Tuesday afternoon, Nora was at the general store, purchasing supplies for the schoolroom, when she overheard a conversation that made her pause. "Abernathy's been out to the Thornton place every day this week," a woman's voice said in a conspiratorial tone, "and him who's never shown interest in any woman since he came back from back east." "Well, she is pretty enough, even if she is a mail-order bride," another woman replied. "Though what she sees in him is beyond me. Cold as ice, that one." "Not cold," a third voice interjected. "Just careful, after what happened with his family and then that girl in Philadelphia. Hush, Beatrice. Here she comes." Nora pretended not to notice the sudden silence as she approached the counter with her selections: chalk, slates, primers, and a map of the United States. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Dawson," she greeted the storekeeper's wife pleasantly. "I hope you'll consider enrolling your children in school this fall. I understand they're quite bright." Mrs. Dawson, A plump woman with shrewd eyes nodded cautiously. Perhaps, though my husband wonders what a city girl knows about raising children out here. I would imagine children need education wherever they live, Nora replied evenly. Reading, writing, arithmetic, these are universal skills. And what about practical knowledge? Another woman challenged. Can you teach them how to survive a drought or treat snakebite? Not yet, Nora admitted. But I'm learning those things myself, and I'm open to having community members share their expertise. Perhaps you'd consider giving a lesson on local medicinal plants, Mrs. Jenkins, Beatrice Jenkins. The woman looked surprised at the suggestion. Well, I suppose I could. Nora smiled. Excellent. Education should be a community endeavor, don't you agree? By the time she left the store, Nora had secured not only promises of student enrollment, but also commitments from several women to share their specialized knowledge in the classroom. It was a small victory, but an important one. She was so pleased with her success that she didn't notice Quentin approaching until he fell into step beside her. You've won over the Dawson clan, he observed. That's no small feat. Nora glanced up at him, shading her eyes against the sun. People generally respond well when you value their knowledge, Mr. Abernathy. Is that what you're doing with me? He asked, his tone light but his eyes searching. I value your knowledge of ranching and your understanding of this community, she replied carefully. But I'm beginning to think there's a great deal about Quentin Abernathy that remains a mystery. He stiffened slightly. Such as why a university-educated man chooses to run cattle in the Arizona territory, or what happened in Philadelphia that brought you back west. Nora held his gaze steadily. Or why you're so determined to help a stranger who arrived on your doorstep. For a moment, she thought he might walk away, then his shoulders relaxed slightly. Those are complicated questions, Miss Hastings. I find that most worthwhile questions are, Mr. Abernathy. A hint of a smile touched his lips. Indeed, perhaps someday I'll answer them. He gestured toward her packages. May I carry those for you? Nora relinquished her burdens, knowing he had deftly changed the subject. As they walked toward the boarding house, Quentin spoke of practical matters, the progress on the schoolhouse, plans for securing the ranch against further intrusions by the Malones, the need for additional fencing on the north boundary. It wasn't until they reached Martha's front gate that he broached a more personal subject. There's a social gathering this Saturday at the Miller's ranch, he said, suddenly seeming less assured. A barn dance, I thought. That is, if you're interested in meeting more of the community. Nora couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. Mr. Abernathy, are you asking me to accompany you to a dance? A faint flush colored his tanned cheeks. I suppose I am, Miss Hastings. Then I accept, she said simply. Thank you for the invitation. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a relaxation of his usually stern mouth. I'll call for you at 6, if that's suitable. Perfectly suitable, Nora agreed. As he tipped his hat and walked away, Nora found herself watching his retreating figure with more interest than was entirely proper. Quentin Abernathy was indeed a mystery, one she was increasingly eager to solve. Saturday evening arrived clear and pleasantly warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage across the valley. Nora had spent far more time than she would admit selecting her dress for the occasion, finally settling on a gown of deep blue silk that she had brought from Philadelphia, hoping to impress her intended husband. It was perhaps more formal than the occasion warranted, but it was the finest garment she owned. Martha helped her arrange her hair, pinning the auburn waves into an elegant chignon with a few artful curls escaping to frame her face. You'll be the belle of the dance, Martha declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Quentin Abernathy won't know what hit him. Mrs. Peterson, Nora protested, feeling her cheeks warm. Mr. Abernathy is simply being neighborly. Martha's knowing smile suggested she thought otherwise, but she merely said, "Of course, dear. Just neighborly." When Quentin arrived promptly at 6, Nora was waiting in the parlor. The sight of him in his formal attire, a well-cut black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, momentarily took her breath away. He had always been handsome in a rugged, imposing way, but dressed for the evening, he was truly striking. From his expression as she rose to greet him, Nora suspected her own appearance had a similar effect on him. "Miss Hastings," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual, "you look beautiful." "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy. You're very handsome yourself." He offered his arm, and they stepped out into the evening, where a buggy waited. The drive to the Miller Ranch took nearly an hour, during which they talked easily of books they had both read, memories of Philadelphia, and their shared love of music. "I haven't played in years," Quentin admitted when Nora mentioned her fondness for the piano. "My mother insisted on lessons, and I continued at university but out here." "Perhaps we could remedy that," Nora suggested. Mrs. Peterson mentioned there's a piano in the church that goes largely unused except on Sundays. The idea seemed to please him. "I'd like that." The Miller Ranch was ablaze with lanterns when they arrived, the large barn cleared of its usual inhabitants and decorated with bunting and wildflowers. A small band of local musicians was already playing, and several couples circled the floor. Their arrival caused a noticeable stir. Quentin Abernathy was respected in the community, but rarely socialized beyond business matters. To see him escorting the newcomer, the mail-order bride, as many still thought of her, was clearly a topic of interest. "Everyone's staring," Nora murmured as he led her toward the refreshment table. "Let them," Quentin replied, unconcerned. "Would you care for some punch?" As the evening progressed, Nora found herself genuinely enjoying the celebration. The people of Apache Junction, once they overcame their initial reserve, proved to be warm and welcoming. Several mothers approached her about the school, and by the time the band struck up a lively Virginia reel, Nora felt almost at home. "May I have this dance, Miss Hastings?" Quentin asked, extending his hand. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Abernathy," she replied, allowing him to lead her onto the floor. Quentin moved with unexpected grace for such a powerful man, guiding her through the steps of the dance with confident ease. Nora, who had always enjoyed dancing but had few opportunities in recent years, found herself laughing with pure pleasure as they circled and twirled. "You dance very well, Mr. Abernathy," she said as the music paused briefly. "As do you, Miss Hastings," he replied, his eyes warm. "Though I confess I'm out of practice." "One wouldn't know it," she assured him. The band began a waltz, and without hesitation, Quentin drew her into his arms. The proper distance between them seemed to diminish as they moved together across the floor, his hand firm at her waist, hers resting lightly on his shoulder. "I'm glad you came to Apache Junction, Nora," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time. The intimacy of it, coupled with the intensity in his gray eyes, made her heart skip. "Even though I arrived under such unusual circumstances, perhaps especially because of them," he replied. "You've shown remarkable courage and adaptability. Those are rare qualities anywhere, but particularly valuable here." "You've been extraordinarily kind to me, Quentin," she said, testing the sound of his name on her lips. "I'm not sure I would have survived these first weeks without your help." "You would have," he said with certainty. "You're stronger than you know." The music ended, and they stood for a moment, still close, until the sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell. "Abernathy," a rough voice called. "A word." Quentin turned, his expression hardening as he recognized Frank Malone. The man looked sober enough, but his eyes held a dangerous glint. "This isn't the time or place, Malone," Quentin said evenly. "It's about time you stopped interfering in my business," Malone continued, ignoring the warning. His gaze shifted to Nora. "And you, lady. You'd be wise to sell that worthless piece of land before something unfortunate happens." Quentin stepped forward, placing himself between Nora and Malone. "That's enough. Leave now, or I'll have the sheriff escort you out," Malone sneered. "The sheriff's your puppet like everyone else in this town." He leaned to the side, addressing Nora directly. "Ask him about Philadelphia, Miss Hastings. Ask him why he really came back west. Might change your mind about keeping such respectable company." "Get out," Quentin said, his voice dangerously quiet. For a tense moment, it seemed Malone might challenge him. Then, with a mocking tip of his hat, he turned and sauntered away. The confrontation had drawn attention, and a hush had fallen over the nearby dancers. Quentin turned to Nora, his expression guarded. "I apologize for that interruption. Would you like to continue dancing?" But the evening's magic had been broken. "Actually, I'm feeling a bit tired," Nora said. "Would you mind terribly if we left soon?" Relief flickered across his face. "Not at all. Let me just say our goodbyes to the Millers." The drive back to town was quiet, the easy conversation of earlier replaced by an uncomfortable tension. Malone's words hung between them like a storm cloud. Finally, Nora broke the silence. "You don't owe me any explanations, Quentin." He kept his eyes on the road, his profile sharp in the moonlight. Malone was trying to cause trouble, nothing more. "I understand," Nora said, though in truth she didn't. What had happened in Philadelphia that could be used against him? What secrets did Quentin Abernathy carry? When they reached the boarding house, he helped her down from the buggy, his touch formal once more. "Thank you for accompanying me this evening, Miss Hastings." They were back to surnames then. "Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Abernathy. I had a lovely time despite the unpleasantness at the end." He nodded stiffly, then hesitated. "Nora, there are things in my past that I'm not proud of, but please believe that my intentions toward you have been honorable." "I never doubted that," she said softly. For a moment she thought he might say more. Instead, he lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night." Nora watched him drive away, her emotions in turmoil. The evening had shown her a different side of Quentin, charming, attentive, almost tender. Yet Malone's insinuations and Quentin's reaction to them suggested there was indeed something in his past that troubled him deeply. As she prepared for bed, Nora found herself thinking of the whispered conversation she had overheard in the general store. What had happened with that girl in Philadelphia? And why did it matter so much to her? The answer, though she was reluctant to acknowledge it, was becoming increasingly clear. In the span of just a few weeks, Quentin Abernathy had become important to her not merely as a neighbor or a friend, but as a man whose good opinion she valued and whose company she craved. She was falling in love with him. The realization should have alarmed her. She had come to Apache Junction to marry Jacob Thornton, a man she had never met, but with whom she had corresponded for months. To find herself developing feelings for another man so quickly seemed disloyal somehow, even if Jacob was no longer alive. Yet as Nora drifted toward sleep, she couldn't deny the truth. Her heart, which she had been prepared to offer in a practical arrangement with a stranger, was now entangled with a man who remained, in many ways, just as much of a mystery. The following weeks brought a rhythm to Nora's new life in Apache Junction. The schoolhouse was completed ahead of schedule, and she began teaching 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 16. The work was challenging but rewarding, and she found herself adapting her Eastern education to the practical needs of frontier children. Her relationship with Quentin had returned to its earlier formality after the dance, though he still called regularly to check on her and the ranch. If their conversations lacked the warmth they had briefly shared, Nora told herself it was for the best. Whatever his secrets, Quentin clearly wished to maintain a certain distance. It was during this period of adjustment that Nora received an unexpected visitor at the schoolhouse one afternoon after the children had been dismissed. Miss Hastings. A young woman stood in the doorway, her simple calico dress and sunbonnet suggesting she was from one of the outlying farms. "Might I have a word?" "Of course," Nora replied, setting aside the slate she'd been cleaning. "Please come in." The woman stepped inside, removing her bonnet to reveal a pretty face framed by blonde curls. She appeared to be about Nora's age, perhaps a year or two younger. "I'm Rebecca Turner," she introduced herself. I wanted to meet you. People are talking about you and Quentin, and I thought." A prickle of unease ran down Nora's spine. "Mr. Abernathy has been very helpful to me since my arrival," she said carefully. "Is there something specific you wish to discuss, Miss Turner?" Rebecca twisted her bonnet in her hands, clearly uncomfortable. "It's just, I thought you should know, about Quentin and me." Nora's heart sank. Was this a former sweetheart, or perhaps a current one? "Please go on." "We were engaged," Rebecca blurted out. 3 years ago, before he went back east. He promised to return and marry me, but then—" Her voice faltered. "When he came back, he was different, cold. He said he couldn't marry me after all, that things had changed." He offered no explanation, just ended it. Nora sat down slowly, gesturing for Rebecca to take a seat as well. "I'm very sorry to hear that, Miss Turner, but I'm not sure why you're telling me this." Rebecca's blue eyes filled with tears. "Because I still love him. And I see the way he looks at you, the way he never looked at me, even when we were engaged. I wanted to warn you. He might break your heart too." "Mr. Abernathy and I are merely neighbors," Nora said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "Perhaps now," Rebecca acknowledged. "But it won't stay that way, not with the way he watches you when you're not looking." An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Finally, Nora asked the question foremost in her mind. "Do you know what happened in Philadelphia? Why he changed?" Rebecca shook her head. "He never told me. He came back without warning, stayed at his ranch for weeks without seeing anyone, and when he finally came to town—" She sighed. It was like a different man had returned wearing Quentin's face. After Rebecca left, Nora sat alone in the schoolroom, trying to process this new information. Quentin had been engaged before he went east, had broken that engagement upon his return, and whatever had happened in Philadelphia had changed him profoundly. The pieces still didn't fit together, but one thing was increasingly clear: Quentin Abernathy carried wounds that had not healed, and those wounds were keeping him from allowing anyone close, including her. That evening, as Nora walked from the schoolhouse to the boarding house, lost in thought, she nearly collided with a man emerging from the saloon. "Well, if it isn't the schoolmarm," Frank Malone drawled, steadying himself against the hitching post. He wasn't drunk, but he'd clearly had a few drinks. "Still letting Abernathy court you, I see." "Excuse me, Mr. Malone," Nora said stiffly, attempting to pass him. He stepped into her path. "Not so fast. I've been thinking. Maybe I've been approaching this all wrong. Instead of trying to buy your land, maybe I should just marry you." His smile was predatory. "Save me a lot of money, and you'd get a real man, not some Eastern dandy playing at being a rancher." "That's quite enough, Mr. Malone," Nora said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Please step aside." "Or what?" he challenged, moving closer. "You'll call for Abernathy. He ain't here to protect you now, is he?" "She doesn't need protection," a new voice intervened. but you might. Sheriff William Hayes stepped out of the shadows, his hand resting casually on his holstered pistol. Tall and graying at the temples, Hayes had a reputation for quiet competence. Malone's face darkened, but he backed away. Just having a friendly conversation, Sheriff. Take your friendly conversation elsewhere, Hayes suggested mildly. Miss Hastings, may I escort you to Mrs. Peterson's? Thank you, Sheriff, Nora said gratefully. As they walked, Hayes spoke in a low voice. Malone's been drinking more than usual lately. His cattle operation isn't doing well, and he's desperate for water rights. He seems to have a particular animosity toward Quentin, Nora observed. Hayes nodded. That goes back a ways. Quentin testified against Frank's father in a land dispute 10 years ago. Old man Malone lost everything, drank himself to death within a year. Frank and his brother have nursed that grudge ever since. I see, Nora murmured. Another piece of the puzzle, but still not the whole picture. Be careful around him, Hayes advised as they reached the boarding house. Frank Malone isn't known for his restraint, especially when he's drinking. The warning proved prophetic. 3 days later, Nora was at her ranch, working in the garden with Tom Russell's wife Sarah, when the sound of approaching riders made them both look up. Frank Malone and 3 men she didn't recognize reined in their horses at the edge of the property. All were armed, and none looked friendly. Afternoon, ladies, Frank called, his voice carrying across the yard. Where's young Tom today? Checking the north boundary, Sarah replied, her hand tightening on her trowel. He'll be back soon. Frank laughed. Not too soon, I hope. We've got business to discuss. He dismounted, sauntering toward them with a confidence that made Nora's skin crawl. Miss Hastings, I've come with an offer. $500 for the ranch, cash money, more than fair for a piece of land you can't possibly manage. The ranch isn't for sale, Mr. Malone, Nora replied evenly. Not to you, not to anyone. His expression hardened. I don't think you understand your position, madam. You're alone out here, except for Tom's little wife. My men and I could make things very unpleasant for you. Sarah stepped forward, her face pale but determined. We're not alone, Mr. Malone. Oh, and who's going to stop us? Abernathy. He's in Tucson on business, won't be back for days. Frank moved closer, his hand coming to rest on his holstered pistol. Last chance, Miss Hastings. Take the money or face the consequences. Nora stood her ground, though her heart raced. The answer is still no, Mr. Malone. Now please leave my property. Frank's smile disappeared. Boys, he called to his men. Looks like we need to teach these ladies a lesson about hospitality. The men dismounted, spreading out in a way that cut off any escape route to the house. Nora and Sarah backed up until they were against the garden fence. What do you want us to do with them, Frank? One of the men asked, his eyes fixed on Sarah in a way that made Nora's blood run cold. Take them to the house, Frank ordered. We'll decide once we're comfortable. Before the men could move, the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked came from behind them. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Malone. Quentin's voice rang out, deadly calm. Nora's relief was so intense she nearly collapsed. Quentin sat on his black stallion at the edge of the yard, his rifle aimed squarely at Frank. Behind him were 3 of his ranch hands, similarly armed. Frank froze, then slowly raised his hands. Abernathy, thought you were in Tucson. Changed my plans, Quentin replied evenly. Lucky for these ladies, wouldn't you say? The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Nora held her breath, certain that any moment violence would erupt. Instead, Quentin spoke again, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. You and your men are going to mount up and ride out, Malone. You're going to stay off this property, and you're going to stop harassing Miss Hastings. If I ever find you here again, I'll shoot you where you stand. There was no bluster in his tone, No empty threat, just a statement of fact. Frank's face contorted with rage, but he was no fool. Outnumbered and outgunned, he had no choice but to retreat. "This ain't over, Abernathy," he snarled as he swung back into his saddle. "Yes, it is," Quentin corrected him. "You just don't know it yet." The Malone party rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving behind a silence broken only by the soft whimpering of Sarah, who had finally given in to her fear. Quentin dismounted and crossed to where Nora stood, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt?" "No," she managed, her voice unsteady. "How did you know?" "Hayes sent word that Malone was making threats in the saloon last night. I was on my way to check on you when we saw their horses." His expression was grim. "This has gone far enough. It's time to put an end to it." "What do you mean?" Nora asked, alarmed by the cold determination in his voice. "I mean that Frank Malone has been a problem in this territory for too long," Quentin replied, "and I intend to see him dealt with, once and for all." The next few days passed in a state of heightened tension. Quentin insisted that Nora stay in town, and he posted men at the ranch to protect the property. Sheriff Hayes increased his patrols, but the Malone brothers seemed to have gone to ground, their whereabouts unknown. Nora continued teaching, unwilling to let fear disrupt the children's education, but she was constantly aware of the undercurrent of danger. Quentin himself escorted her to and from the schoolhouse each day, his presence both reassuring and concerning. The cold fury in his eyes when Malone's name was mentioned suggested he was planning something beyond legal recourse. On the fourth evening after the confrontation at the ranch, Nora was grading assignments in her room at the boarding house when a soft knock came at her door. "Quentin," she said in surprise when she opened it. "Is something wrong? May I come in?" he asked. "It's important." Nora hesitated. Having a man in her private room was hardly proper, but the gravity in his expression overrode conventional concerns. "Of course." He entered, removing his hat but declining her offer to sit. Instead, he stood by the window, looking out at the darkening street. "I'm leaving at first light," he said without preamble. "Hayes has located the Malones at their hideout in the Superstition Mountains. We're riding out to arrest them." Alarm coursed through Nora. "Is that wise? Surely it's a job for the marshal, not a civilian posse." "Hayes has the authority and I have a personal stake in this," Quentin replied. "The Malones won't come peacefully. There will likely be bloodshed." "Then don't go," Nora urged, moving to stand before him. "Let the law handle it." "I am the law in a sense," he said quietly. "I'm a deputy marshal, have been for years, though I don't advertise the fact. It allows me to operate more effectively." This revelation surprised her, but it explained much about his authority in the territory. "Even so, it's dangerous." "Yes," he agreed. "That's why I came tonight. There are things you should know in case—" "Don't," Nora interrupted, unable to bear the thought. "Don't speak as if you might not return." He caught her hands in his grip firm but gentle. "Nora, please, this is important." The use of her given name, coupled with the intensity in his gray eyes, silenced her protests. She nodded for him to continue. "My family has been in this territory for 3 generations, he began. "My grandfather established the AA, my father expanded it, and I was supposed to follow in their footsteps. But I was restless, wanted more than ranch life. I went east to university, studied law. While in Philadelphia, I met a woman, Elizabeth Blackwood." The name sent a chill through Nora. This, then, was the mystery of Philadelphia. "We became engaged," Quentin continued, his voice level but strained. "Her father was a prominent judge, her family wealthy and influential. I thought I loved her, and perhaps I did in my way. But then my father died unexpectedly, and I had to return to take charge of the ranch." He released Nora's hands, turning back to the window. Elizabeth agreed to come west with me once I settled the estate. But when I returned to Philadelphia 6 months later, I found her changed. She had become engaged to another man, a banker, more suited to her social station. She hadn't bothered to inform me. "I'm so sorry," Nora murmured. "It wasn't just the betrayal," Quentin said, his profile sharp against the fading light. "It was discovering that everything between us had been a lie. She had never intended to come west. She had seen me as a diversion, an exotic frontier specimen to entertain her society friends." The bitterness in his voice revealed how deeply the wound still festered. When I confronted her, she laughed, said I was naive to think a woman of her breeding would ever consider burying herself in a savage territory with a glorified cowboy. Nora winced at the cruelty of it. "I returned home, bitter and disillusioned," Quentin continued. "I threw myself into expanding the ranch, took on the deputy marshal role, and—" He hesitated. "And I ended my engagement to Rebecca Turner. She deserved someone who could love her wholly, not a man carrying such anger." "Is that why you've kept your distance from everyone?" Nora asked softly. "Because of what happened with Elizabeth?" He turned to face her, his expression vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "I swore I wouldn't risk my heart again. That I would focus on building something lasting in this territory without the complication of personal attachments. And then I arrived," Nora said, understanding dawning. "Another Eastern woman, potentially another disappointment." "Yes," he admitted. "At first. But you proved to be nothing like Elizabeth. Your courage, your determination to adapt, your genuine care for the children you teach." He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're everything she wasn't, Nora, real, true, brave beyond measure." Nora's heart thundered in her chest. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I may not return tomorrow," he said simply. "And I couldn't bear the thought of leaving without you knowing the truth about my past and about my feelings for you." "And what are those feelings?" Nora whispered, scarcely daring to hope. In answer, Quentin closed the distance between them, cradling her face in his hands with exquisite tenderness. "I love you, Nora Hastings. I think I have from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, determined to face whatever the future held." Joy bloomed in Nora's chest, so intense it was almost painful. "I love you too, Quentin. I never expected to find love here, but somehow—" He silenced her with a kiss, gentle at first, then deepening as she responded, her arms winding around his neck. In that moment, all the uncertainty, all the danger, all the propriety that should have kept them apart melted away, leaving only the truth of what they felt for each other. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Quentin pressed his forehead to hers. "When this is over," he promised, "when the Malones are no longer a threat, I want to court you properly, if you'll allow it." Nora smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I think we're well beyond the point of formal courtship, Mr. Abernathy." A slow smile spread across his face, the first true, unguarded smile she had seen from him. "Nevertheless, Miss Hastings, I intend to do things right, starting with coming back to you safely tomorrow." "You had better," she warned, her tone lightening despite the fear that still lurked beneath her happiness. "I'll be very cross if you don't." He laughed softly, then sobered. "I should go. Dawn comes early." Nora nodded, reluctantly releasing him. "Be careful, Quentin. The Malones are dangerous men." "So am I," he replied with quiet confidence. "Especially when I have something worth fighting for." With one last lingering kiss, he left her, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Nora stood at the window, watching as his tall figure crossed the street and disappeared into the gathering darkness. Sleep was impossible that night. Nora paced her small room, alternating between fervent prayers for Quentin's safety and practical plans for their future. By dawn, she had made a decision she would not sit idly by, waiting for news. Instead, she dressed in her most practical clothes and made her way to the sheriff's office. Deputy Jim Parker, a young man barely out of his teens, was manning the desk when she arrived. "Miss Hastings," he greeted her, surprised. "What brings you here so early?" "I need to know where the posse is heading," Nora said without preamble. "The exact location." Parker shook his head. "I can't tell you that, madam. Sheriff's orders." "It's important, deputy," Nora insisted. "I may have information that could help them." It was a lie, of course, but she was desperate. Parker, however, remained firm. "I'm sorry, Miss Hastings. No one's supposed to know where they're going, for safety." Frustrated but undeterred, Nora left the sheriff's office and headed directly to the Double Ranch. If anyone would know Quentin's plans, it would be his foreman, Henry Wilson. The ride took nearly an hour, during which time the sun rose fully, promising another scorching day. The Double Ranch house came into view, a substantial two-story structure of stone and timber, surrounded by barns, corrals, and outbuildings. It was a testament to 3 generations of Abernathy vision and hard work. Henry Wilson met her at the main house, his weathered face grave when she explained her presence. "Miss Hastings, the boss was clear that you were to stay in town safe." "I don't intend to follow them," Nora said, though in truth, she wasn't entirely sure what she did intend. "I just need to know where they've gone in case." "In case what?" "In case Quentin was wounded and needed her, in case he didn't return at all." The possibilities were too painful to articulate. Henry studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "They're headed for Malone's camp in Needle Canyon. It's about 6 hours' ride from here in the heart of the superstitions." "Thank you," Nora said, relief flooding through her. "That's all I needed to know." As she turned to leave, Henry called after her, "Miss Hastings, the boss. He cares for you, more than I've ever seen him care for anyone. Whatever you're planning, please be careful." Nora nodded, touched by the old foreman's concern. "I will be." She had no intention of riding into a potential gunfight. She wasn't that foolish. But knowing where Quentin and the others were heading gave her a sense of control, a way to direct her prayers more specifically. And if by nightfall there was no word, well, she would cross that bridge when she came to it. The day passed with excruciating slowness. Nora taught her classes, though she doubted she was particularly effective, given her distraction. The children seemed to sense her unease and were unusually subdued. By mid-afternoon, word had spread through town about the posse's mission, and an air of tense expectation hung over Apache Junction. When the last student had departed, Nora sat alone in the schoolhouse, staring at the clock. The posse would have reached Needle Canyon by now. Whatever was going to happen would be happening soon. The sound of horses galloping down the main street sent her rushing to the window. 3 riders were approaching at speed, not the full posse, but enough to suggest news. Nora's heart leapt to her throat when she recognized one of them as Quentin. Without stopping to gather her things, she ran outside, reaching the street just as the riders pulled up in front of the sheriff's office. Quentin dismounted, his movements stiff, and Nora saw with horror that his left arm was bound in a makeshift sling, dark blood staining the fabric of his shirt. "Quentin," she called, hurrying toward him. He turned at the sound of her voice, his face lighting up despite his obvious pain. "Nora!" She reached him, hands hovering over his injured arm. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he assured her, though the pallor of his face belied his words. "Just a graze." "What happened?" "The Malones are no longer a problem," he finished grimly. "Frank resisted arrest. He didn't survive. Dean's in custody." Relief and horror mingled in Nora's chest. A man was dead, yet the threat was over. And the others, Sheriff Hayes, all fine. "They're bringing Dean in separately." Quentin swayed slightly, and Nora quickly slipped her arm around his waist to steady him. "You need a doctor," she said firmly. "What I need is you," he murmured, his good arm encircling her shoulders. "I kept thinking of you while we were riding out. Of your smile, your courage. It gave me strength." Despite the public setting, despite the blood and dust, Nora felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly overwhelmed her. "Let's get you to Dr. Wilson's," she said, keeping her voice steady with effort. "Then we can talk about everything." Quentin allowed her to guide him toward the doctor's small office at the end of the street. As they walked, he asked softly, "Did you mean what you said last night, Nora, about loving me?" "With all my heart," she replied without hesitation. "Though I'm beginning to think loving a deputy marshal might be hazardous to my peace of mind." A smile tugged at his lips. "I could resign the position." "Don't you dare," she countered. "This territory needs men like you to keep order. I'll simply have to become accustomed to worrying about you." His arm tightened around her shoulders. "I'll give you less cause to worry in the future. I promise." 3 weeks later, on a perfect autumn morning, Nora Hastings became Nora Abernathy in a simple ceremony at the Apache Junction church. The entire town turned out for the occasion, curious to witness the union of the formidable rancher and the schoolteacher who had arrived as a mail-order bride for another man. Standing before the reverend, Quentin's eyes never left Nora's face as they exchanged their vows. His injured arm had healed enough that he could hold both her hands in his as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her for all his days. Afterward, at the reception held at the Double Ranch, Martha Peterson dabbed at her eyes as she confided to Beatrice Jenkins, "Never seen a man so in love." And to think it all started with that awful mix-up when she arrived. "Providence works in mysterious ways," Beatrice agreed sagely. "Though I wonder what would have happened if Jacob Thornton hadn't been shot." Martha shook her head. "Some things are just meant to be." Those two would have found each other somehow. Across the festively decorated yard, Quentin led Nora in their first dance as husband and wife, his movements as graceful as they had been at the barn dance that had first brought them closer. "Happy, Mrs. Abernathy?" he asked, his voice low and intimate despite the crowd around them. "Deliriously so, Mr. Abernathy," Nora replied, her eyes shining with joy. "Though I'm still getting used to my new name." "You have a lifetime to adjust," he promised, drawing her closer than was strictly proper for a public dance. "A lifetime of building something wonderful together." "The ranch," she teased. "The ranch, yes," he agreed. "But more importantly, a family, a legacy of love." Nora's heart swelled at the thought. Already, she and Quentin had discussed children, perhaps many of them, filling the large ranch house with laughter and learning. "I love you, Quentin Abernathy," she whispered as the music drew to a close. "From the moment you met me at that stagecoach, something in me recognized something in you even through all the confusion and grief." "And I love you, Nora Abernathy," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "From the moment you stood in the dust of Main Street, refusing to collapse, despite having your world turned upside down, I knew you were extraordinary." As the sun began to set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Nora gazed around at the gathering her students and their families, Martha and the other boarders, Henry Wilson and the ranch hands, even Rebecca Turner, who had come to wish them well with genuine warmth. This place that had seemed so foreign, so intimidating just months ago, was now home. These people were her community, her friends, and the man beside her, whose love shone in every glance, every touch, was her future. They had both traveled long roads to find each other, Quentin from the bitter disappointment of Philadelphia, Nora from the grief and uncertainty of her life in the East. That their paths had converged in this remote corner of the Arizona Territory seemed nothing short of miraculous. Later that evening, as they stood on the porch of their home, the large ranch house that would be their sanctuary and the center of their life together, Quentin wrapped his arms around Nora from behind, both of them gazing up at the star-filled desert sky. "Do you ever wonder," he murmured against her hair, "what might have happened if Jacob had met you that day instead of me?" Nora turned in his embrace, meeting his eyes in the soft glow of the porch lantern. "No," she said truthfully. "Because even then, even before I knew you, I felt something when I saw you standing there, as if my heart recognized yours before we had even spoken." Quentin's smile was tender as he traced the curve of her cheek with his fingertips. "They called you a mail-order bride," he said softly. "But from the moment I saw you, so brave and determined despite everything, I called you mine in my heart. Even then, before you'd had a chance to leave town, I knew." "Knew what?" Nora asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "That you were meant to be here," he replied, drawing her closer. "Not as Jacob's wife, but as mine. That fate or God or whatever force brings souls together had arranged for us to find each other, against all odds." As his lips met hers in a kiss that held the promise of all their tomorrows, Nora knew with absolute certainty that he was right. Their story had begun with loss and confusion, but it would continue with love and purpose, stretching out before them like the vast, beautiful territory they called home. And in the years that followed through the birth of their children, the growth of the ranch, the development of Apache Junction into a thriving community, Nora and Quentin Abernathy would often look back on that fateful day when a mail-order bride stepped off a stagecoach and into the arms of destiny. 5 years after their wedding, Nora stood on the porch of their home, watching as Quentin taught their 4-year-old son, James, to ride his first pony. Their 2-year-old daughter, Emily, clutched at Nora's skirts, wide-eyed as her brother bounced precariously in the small saddle. "Careful, Quentin," Nora called, unable to suppress her maternal concern despite knowing her husband would never let their son come to harm. Quentin looked up with a grin that still had the power to make her heart skip a beat. "He's doing fine, aren't you, James?" The little boy, a miniature version of his father with the same storm-gray eyes and determined chin, nodded solemnly. "I'm not scared, Mama." "Of course you're not," Nora agreed, smiling. "You're an Abernathy after all." Later that evening, with the children asleep and the ranch settling into night's quietude, Nora and Quentin sat together on the porch swing, her head resting on his shoulder as they enjoyed a rare moment of peace. "I received a letter from Rebecca today," Nora mentioned. "She and David are expecting their second child in the spring." Quentin nodded, genuinely pleased for his former fiancée and her husband. "That's wonderful news." "And apparently Sheriff Hayes is finally courting Martha Peterson," Nora continued, a smile in her voice. "It only took him 3 years to work up the courage." "Hayes always was cautious," Quentin chuckled. "But he's a good man. Martha deserves happiness." They fell into comfortable silence, the only sounds the creaking of the swing and the distant lowing of cattle. Nora closed her eyes, savoring the contentment that filled her life, so different from the uncertainty she had felt that first day in Apache Junction. "You ever wonder," she asked softly, "what would have happened if you hadn't been the one to meet me that day?" Quentin's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I used to, not anymore." "Oh, why is that?" His lips brushed her temple, gentle and warm. "Because I've come to believe that no matter what happened, we would have found each other, if not that day, then another. If not in Apache Junction, then somewhere else." Nora smiled, lifting her face to meet his gaze. "My practical, logical husband believing in fate, not fate," he corrected, his eyes tender in the moonlight. Just the certainty that some souls are meant to journey together. Ours are two such souls, Nora. As his lips met hers in a kiss that held all the passion and tenderness of their years together, and the promise of many more to come, Nora knew he was right. What had begun as a journey marked by labels and misconceptions, mail-order bride, difficult rancher, had transformed into something profound and enduring. Love, true and deep, had a way of finding its path, even in the wild and unpredictable terrain of the West. And sometimes, that path led exactly where you were meant to be all along.